Chapter 033. Gateways. Standing still in the empty living room inside Vazen's house, Zorian stared unhappily at the splatter of green gunk in front of him that was currently eating through the floor with an audible sizzle. One could hardly tell that not too long ago the acid slime in front of him used to be a stack of important documents stored in Vazen's safe. The merchant really didn't want anyone to take a look at these, it seemed. The operation started well. Everything started well. Not seeing the point of reinventing the wheel, Zorian used his past method of entering Vazen's home, then began dismantling the protections on the safe. Aside from the already familiar explosion trap, he also found a sleep trap which aimed to knock any prospective thieves unconscious the moment they touched the safe. He disabled both traps and, having found no further spell work protecting the safe, immediately tried to remove the documents. He promptly triggered a mechanical mechanism that dumped some kind of powerful acidic mixture on top of the safe's contents. The good news was that he managed to avoid getting any of the gunk on his hands. Considering what the stuff was doing to the floor at the moment, it would have probably eaten right through his bones before he managed to get it off of him. The bad news was that he failed to salvage any of the safe's contents before the gunk ruined it. He managed to levitate the contents out of the safe, yes, but the gunk was almost like glue in the way it clung to the papers. He was unable to separate it from the surviving documents before it ate through them all and then happily continued to dissolve the floor beneath them. He shuddered. He was really glad he managed to yank his hands away in time to avoid getting any of that stuff on them. Once again, Zorian was forced to leave Vazen's place empty-handed. He was sorely tempted to rig the entire place to explode in Vazen's face the moment he came back home as revenge, but that would be petty and stupid. A murder of such an influential man would attract a lot of attention, plus Alanik was probably paying very close attention to the man. And he had tried to rob the man after all, so he had no right to be particularly outraged anyway. Zorian was now absolutely certain that Vazen was involved in some very shady things, and he wasn't talking about tax fraud or industrial espionage. There was no way that Vazen would rig his safe to destroy things like business contracts and production blueprints in the event of discovery. The sheer amount of money he'd lost doing that must have been exorbitant. There had to be something more in there among those papers. Something incredibly illegal and incriminating, to the point where Vazen would rather lose everything than be discovered possessing it. He was definitely coming back in the next restart. Maybe the man's misdeeds were unconnected to the Abasan invaders gunning after Cyoria or the group targeting soul mages around Nyazovdveri, but somehow Zorian doubted it. Cost him nothing to check in any case. Well, unless Vazen had even more horrifying surprises waiting for him should he overcome the second layer of his defenses. Next time he was bringing a 10-foot pole with him because there was no way he was putting his hands into that safe anymore. The day after he had survived the failed ambush just outside Alanik's temple, Zorian arrived at his next meditation session feeling more than a little bit apprehensive. And not just about the possibility of another ambush. He did not like the looks Alanik had been giving him when he was giving his statement, and Zorian was worried about what that meant for him. However, the lesson that day had been wholly unremarkable. There had been no second ambush, and Alanik gave no indication he was upset or suspicious of him. Thus he put it out of his mind and decided to follow Alanik's example by carrying on as if nothing happened. Now 3 days later, Zorian could safely say that had been a mistake. Being dragged into the temple courtyard for a test of his combat skills sounded suspiciously like punishment to his ears. As an aside, why did a temple have a battle arena in its courtyard instead of a nice, peaceful garden or something? Between that and the dungeons in the basement, he was starting to get really dubious about this building's spiritual credentials. Not that I don't appreciate your help in shoring up my modest combat capabilities, but we really should be focusing on getting my inner soul sight functioning, said Zorian, shuffling uncomfortably in place. You told me yourself that this skill requires total focus for me to master correctly. Alanik simply continued staring at him, silent and impassive, from his corner of the arena. And then he gestured with his staff at Zorian and threw a fireball at him. Zorian was not surprised at the attack. He had been expecting something like that, to be honest. What did throw him for a loop was that he chose that particular spell to open combat with. Fireball wasn't something you threw at a junior mage to test them. It was far too lethal for that. Even a stunted one was capable of killing a human on a direct hit, and a regular shield spell could not protect against it. No matter how powerful, it was still just a disk of force in front of the caster. The expanding sphere of fiery energy would just flow around it and envelop the caster behind it. The shock lasted for but a moment, however, and then he immediately erected a dome of force around himself. Not just a shield, but a full-blown aegis that protected him from all sides at once. The fireball hit the dome not long after, and Zorian's view was momentarily blanked out by a blanket of fire. When the fire cleared, he found himself standing in front of Alanik again, the priest as silent and unmoving as he had ever been. His apprehension at the situation dropped slightly. The fireball had been a very weak one. He knew because one of the retired mages he'd helped in his aimless wanderings prior to his arrival in Nyazovdveri had taught him how to get feedback from his defensive spells, and his aegis had held strong against a spell that should have taxed it to its limit. Zorian was sure the man in front of him could have done much better than that if he had wanted to. The fact he hadn't immediately followed up on his fireball with something to finish him off enforced the idea that this really was some kind of test. A very messed up, dangerous test, but he was kind of used to such things at this point. He sent a single magic missile towards Alanik. He could see the man scoff as he lazily raised his arm to block the puny attack and suppressed a smile. Though it looked like a magic missile spell, the projectile was anything but. It didn't so much smash into things as erupt into a spherical wave of force, much like a fireball that used force instead of fire. A force ball, if you will. Alanik will almost certainly use a regular shield instead of a full aegis against a puny magic missile, and then the force ball will. The space in front of Alanik suddenly warped and shimmered, and Zorian's force ball promptly winked out of existence. A dispelling wave of some sort if he guessed correctly. Damn it. Then Alanik decided it was his turn again, and Zorian was too busy dodging bolts of fire and incineration rays to focus on internal cursing. Zorian quickly learned that Alanik loved fire spells. Even after Zorian switched from all-purpose shields to variants specifically designed to tank fire magic at the expense of performance against other damage types, he persisted in using them. After his initial barrage of weak, fast-casting, numerous fire projectiles failed to overwhelm Zorian, he switched to trying to steamroll him with gigantic, slow-moving spheres of fire that didn't explode and instead simply tried to envelop him in their flames. After Zorian managed to dispel them, he responded with more fireballs. And this time he wasn't holding back. Zorian tried to counterattack whenever he spotted an opening, but all of his attacks were neutralized with contemptuous ease. Trying to kick up dust and other visibility obstacles failed because Alanik could somehow cause a gust of wind to disperse such attacks away from him without making a single gesture or visibly exerting himself. Items were useless because he could telekinetically hurl all projectiles away from him with a simple sweeping gesture, and any magical projectiles were blocked, intercepted or dispelled. Even after Zorian started launching projectiles in complicated parabolic, zigzagging or spiral trajectories, the priest seemed to have no problems tracking them and responding. Finally, Zorian was nearly out of mana and decided to go out with a bang. He put most of his remaining mana into a ray of force that he promptly fired at Alanik's face. The attack would have killed the priest had it really connected, though Zorian knew it would never connect. Sure enough, the man simply sidestepped it and Zorian collapsed on the ground in exhaustion, his arms raised in surrender. "I give up," he panted. "Whatever point you wanted to make to me, you've done it. Though if this was all for the sake of showing me I'm not the biggest fish in the pond, you needn't have bothered. I'm well aware how screwed I'd be in a face-off against a veteran battle mage. The point was seeing how long it would take before you started resorting to lethal moves," Alanik said, walking up to him and offering him a hand. Zorian internally debated the merits of casting the Shocking Grasp spell and electrocuting the jerk, but in the end decided to be a bigger man and simply accepted his help in getting up. It probably wouldn't have worked anyway. "I'm rather disappointed it took until you were on your last legs to go for the killing blow." "Oh, screw you, Alanik," snapped Zorian. "What kind of nutjob tries to kill their opponent in a freaking spar?" "You?" Alanik tried, a smirk dancing on his lips. "You did try to kill me at the end, didn't you? That's... I knew it had no chance of actually succeeding. Yes, and I'm certain you realized that a minute or two into the test. You should have stopped holding back at that point, or at least followed my lead in what is an acceptable level of force." "Actually, let's refocus on that issue instead," Zorian said. "What if you had ended up killing me? Some of those spells you tried to hit me with would have put me into a hospital for months if I hadn't tanked them. Possibly kill me outright. The skills I used to survive your test aren't something you had any right to expect of me." I can control what my fires burn, Olenek said matter-of-factly. Zorian was honestly stumped at that. That kind of thing was possible? I also have a divine artifact that can heal any burns so long as the victim is still alive. Regardless of how things looked to you, you were in very little danger. Still, you clearly thought I was being excessively aggressive and you still held back against me. That kind of hesitation will get you killed someday. As it almost did a few days ago. I knew this was about those riflemen I disabled, Zorian mumbled. Yes. Disabled. They tried to kill you with an ambush no less, and you went out of the way to simply knock them out. There is being merciful and there is being stupid. Are you sure you're a priest? Grumbled Zorian. A warrior priest, Olenek clarified. Not every religious order is about peace and forgiveness. And even those that are usually make exceptions for self-defense, in practice if not in theory. Fine, fair enough, Zorian conceded. But why do you care? Why is this so upsetting to you? That's a stupid question. I don't want you to die, that's why. Zorian paused, momentarily stumped for a response. What the hell was that supposed to mean? He really wished Olenek wasn't so utterly unreadable to his empathy. Look, I'll be honest with you. I wasn't really being merciful. You're misreading the whole thing. I simply attacked them in the best manner I had available. Please, Olenek scoffed. I know very well how difficult it would be to take down a group that large non-lethally. Do you really expect me to believe that was the method of attack least dangerous for yourself that you had available? Well, yes, Zorian said. I guess it would help to know that I'm a natural mind mage. I sense all minds around me regardless of physical obstacles or line of sight, and I can launch a crude mental assault on them if I so wish. Using that, I could knock them out outside of their shooting range before they could pinpoint my position. Actually killing them would have entailed entering their attack range so I could cast something more deadly at them. Which I felt was rather suicidal at the time. Olenek gave him a curious look. An interesting ability. I note that not all of the attackers had been disabled by the time the guild task force had arrived. Did you simply not have time to go through them all, or? It's a weak attack, said Zorian. It's not hard to resist. Olenek nodded. Zorian hoped the priest would not question him on the exact mechanics of his ability, as he was not sure he could deceive the man convincingly. Thankfully, it did not seem he would push the issue at the moment. What would you have done if no reinforcements had arrived? Olenek asked. Tried to lure them into a minefield, Zorian shrugged. So yeah. I was fully prepared to blow them up into tiny pieces if they continued to go after me. There's a lot you can accuse me of, but being suicidally merciful isn't one of them. You don't have to worry about me. I'm not so sure about that, Olenek grouched. But it does seem I have misjudged you somewhat. Walk with me. Olenek walked back into the temple proper and Zorian followed him. He soon found himself sitting in a small kitchen that he had never seen before, though that wasn't saying much. He had never really explored the site, fearful of drawing Alanek's ire if he stepped foot in some private sanctum that non-clergy were supposed to never witness. Most temples had at least a couple of those as far as Zorian knew. Misunderstandings aside, the test was quite real, said Olenek once they were seated. I really did want to see what you were capable of combat-wise. And, asked Zorian curiously. You are better than I thought you'd be, said Olenek. Zorian preened at the praise. Olenek didn't seem like the sort to hand it out lightly. But it's clear to me you're no legend in the making. I estimate that your natural mana reserves are average at best, perhaps even below average, and your spells have the feel of a mage who has practiced a lot rather than those of a talented beginner. Zorian scowled, his earlier pride forgotten. A mage as young as you should not have experience in fighting that extensive, continued Olenek. Oh, I had suspected it for a while now and now I am certain. You are not some recent graduate going for a round of wandering before settling down. Or a traveling mage who stumbled onto something way over his head. You are someone who actively looks for trouble. Had been looking for trouble for a while now. Zorian said nothing. He was about to claim that it was trouble that looked for him, not the other way around. But when he really thought about it, that wasn't really true at the moment. He really was looking for trouble right now. It was one of his core goals in Nyazovdvari. He had a good reason for it, but still. I'm not going to ask you to tell me who you are. People who start fighting as young as you must have started to get as good as you are aren't usually the trusting sort. You'd never tell me, and truthfully I have no reason to push you in that regard. No, what I want to know is what your immediate goal is here. I don't believe that you really stumbled upon Lukav's encounter with the boars accidentally, or that the soul marker stamped on your soul is really unconnected to the enemies after our heads. Considering how helpful both me and Lukav have been to you in this past several weeks, I believe we both deserve a little more honesty from you. What is really going on here, Zorian? Regardless of what you may think, my reasons for coming here were exactly as I told them to you, Zorian said. I really did get caught in the aftermath of a soul magic spell. I really did come to Lukav and by extension you because I wanted to understand what had happened to me. None of those were fabrications. But, yes. Olenek prompted. I had done some research on the people behind my attack. The original attack that resulted in the marker on my soul, and uncovered some pretty heavy stuff. They are connected to Sayoria's leadership somehow, and have links to the local branch of the Cult of Dragon. As far as I can see, they are Abasan in origin. One of the reasons I had for coming here, aside from seeking out your help, was that I wanted to get out of their territory. And you think our attackers belong to that group? Surmised Olenek. Considering how large and organized the Abasan group was, I wouldn't be surprised if they had some kind of organization branch here. And the fact both groups make use of undead and soul magic is kind of indicative to my eyes. But I don't actually have any proof and I'm far from certain. Zorian wasn't comfortable about sharing everything with Olenek. For instance, telling him about the invasion or the primordial summoning plot was out of the question, as Olenek would no doubt insist on notifying the Sayoria authorities about those and that could alert Red Robe about Zorian's whereabouts. He did, however, tell him about a lot of other things, like the other disappearances in the area. His own investigation into them had pretty much stalled for the moment, so he had little to lose by telling him about them at this point. After several exhausting hours of back and forth, Olenek all but threw him out of the temple, claiming he had to think about things. Zorian was glad for that as he was thoroughly sick of the entire conversation by that point, even if there was a good chance Olenek would want to have nothing to do with him by tomorrow. Oh well, even if the man refused to see him after this, there was always the next restart. There wasn't that much time left in this restart anyway. Break. Zorian was in the process of affixing a left arm to the wooden golem he was building when a human mind suddenly appeared in his room. He would like to say that he reacted immediately and decisively, but the truth was that he was momentarily paralyzed by surprise and fear, spent several moments fumbling for a response, and then realized that his mysterious attacker was actually Olenek. He glared at the priest that had just teleported into his room without warning, trying to set him on fire with his eyes. Sadly, that ability wasn't one of the things in his repertoire, and Olenek was completely unfazed at his glare. Note to self: find a spell that lets you set whatever you're looking at on fire. What the hell do you think you're doing, Olenek? Zorian snapped. I could have shot you if I hadn't realized who you were in time. Olenek glanced at the half-disassembled rifle on Zorian's bed and raised an eyebrow at him. Well, not with that, obviously, Zorian groused. You didn't turn up for your evening lesson, Olenek said with disapproval. I felt it prudent to check up on you. I kind of thought I should give you some time, Zorian said defensively. You seemed pretty annoyed yesterday. I was disturbed, not angry, Olenek said. I needed some time to think. If I wanted you to skip on your lesson I would have said so. He looked at the half-finished golem and raised his eyebrow at Zorian. A curious choice of materials for a golem. It's a prototype, Zorian said. I don't expect much from my first golem, so I wanted to make it out of something cheap and easy to work with. Olenek shook his head. It doesn't matter really. I suppose I can give you a day off from lessons for one day. Tell me, though, is there anything else you forgot to mention to me yesterday? Not really, no, said Zorian. Nothing except things he had purposely kept to himself anyway. Although I'd like to ask you a question if I may. As a soul magic expert, do you think it's possible to kill a soul? No, Olenek said immediately. What kind of question is that? Do I need to read you passages from the Book of Ezekiel again? No. Zorian protested. No, that will not be necessary. Yes, I know that's what the books say, but the necromancer I told you about, the one who killed my informants. Olenek nodded, indicating he knew what Zorian was talking about. In truth, he didn't know the half of it. For one thing, Zorian had never explained to the priest that those informants had been giant talking spiders. Still, Zorian had told enough of the story for Olenek to follow along. He claimed to have done more than just kill them. He said he killed their very souls to ensure they were never coming back. An empty boast. He was just trying to demoralize you, Olenek scoffed. Souls are unkillable. Corruptible certainly, but you can't destroy them. Even if he had effectively unlimited time to figure something out? Zorian pressed. He did mention he spent decades within a time dilation field while he was ranting at me. Necromancers have been trying to destroy a soul for a millennium without much luck, Olenek said. Finding a way to crack open the indestructible core of the soul to see what makes them tick and if it can be manipulated and duplicated has been the goal of many a necromancer over the ages. And many of those necromancers spent centuries pursuing their grisly work with little regards to morality or pity for the people they experimented upon. I sincerely doubt this one mage can do what 1,000 years of necromantic tradition has failed at just because he spent a couple of months in a time dilation chamber. Provided he made use of such facilities at all, that is. Personally, I find it much more likely he's making things up. What if it's more than just months, though? Zorian pressed. Years, even decades? You mean like that old drivel about black rooms that various organizations supposedly have? Asked Olenek. Those rumors are almost certainly false. They are not impossible in theory but much harder than they sound in practice. The logistics of time dilation chambers is very complex and requires more than just capability to speed up the passage of time in an area. And that's especially true for things like necromantic experiments, which require a constant stream of victims to serve as experiment subjects. Unless your boasting necromancer has access to something like the Sovereign Gate, his claims are laughable. Sovereign Gate? Asked Zorian. Never heard of that story? Olenek asked. Zorian shook his head in negative. Well, do you at least know who Shuddertrana Ilkish was? How could I not? Zorian scowled. My history teacher made us all memorize the first 3 chapters of the 13 Cities of Salah by heart. That would be the last king of Ecos, yes? The man who conquered all of the city-states around the Umaniri River and created the Icosian Empire. What does he have to do with anything? The Sovereign Gate is an artifact supposedly dating back from his time, Olenek said. Like many great rulers, Shuddertrana has a great many fanciful stories and grandiose claims associated with him, and this particular one claims he either made or found a doorway into another world. Having found he did not age at all while on the other side, he spent 11 lifetimes there, learning their secrets and honing his skills. Eventually he grew homesick and decided to go back home. Once he was back in his own world, however, he found the doors forever barred to him. He stored the Sovereign Gate in his royal vault, there to wait for a worthy successor who would repeat his feat and usher the empire into a new age with the wisdom gained from the other side. Or well, resurrect it, since it is thoroughly dead at this point. An interesting story, Zorian said. But probably just that, a story, said Olenek. It would have probably remained half-forgotten in some decaying tome as one of the many obscure tales surrounding the first emperor, but Eldamar's royal family is very fond of it, since they claim to have the Sovereign Gate in their possession. Oh. Yes, though in all honesty I'm not the best person to ask about that topic. Personally, I think the whole thing is fabricated drivel which Eldamar royals thought up to give themselves some additional legitimacy. They never mentioned the gate or any of the other Icosian artifacts they apparently had until they had their ambitions and reputation dashed in the Splinter Wars. They probably just swiped one of the Bakura gates from somewhere and are trying to pass it off as a genuine Icosian artifact with fanciful stories. You should probably find an actual historian for a proper discussion on the subject. Fair enough, said Zorian. I was just curious. What are Bakura gates, though? Also something you should ask a historian about, said Olenek. To put it simply, they are some kind of ancient teleportation network that predates Icosian civilization by a fair margin. No one knows much about the Bakura, since they only left their gate network and a handful of other artifacts behind, but their reach was vast. The gates can be found all over Mycena, Altazia and even Blantyre. Sadly, the art of actually activating the gates has been lost to the sands of time, or maybe their magic simply broke down a long time ago and they no longer work. Regardless of the truth, they are mostly just historical curiosities now. Modern mages have their own teleportation network up and functioning, so most of the interest in the Bakura gates has dried up, at least on the mage side. After reminding Zorian not to skip the lesson tomorrow as well, Olenek decided to leave in the same manner he arrived, by teleporting out. Zorian shook his head to clear it of fanciful tales of ancient artifacts and continued working on his golem prototype. He would go ask Vani about the Sovereign Gate and the Bakura Gate network tomorrow, though he didn't expect that to go anywhere. While the story about the first emperor of Icosia could be sort of interpreted as an account of the time loop, it made no sense that an artifact that was supposedly stored in the capital would cause an effect centered around Zack in Scioria. Well, it hurt him nothing to ask. It was only half an hour later that Zorian realized that Alanik had teleported inside his room despite the fact he had warded it against teleportation. Frowning, Zorian wrote down a reminder for himself to tear down his current ward scheme in the coming days and put up something stronger. And a second reminder to ask Alanik how the hell he had done that. Zorian had been worried that Vane might not welcome him into his home the way he had the last time they'd spoken in the previous restart. After all, he hadn't spent the month visibly culling the winter wolf population like he had last time, and that seemed to have had great influence on him. As it turned out, he need not have worried. The man was as friendly and helpful as ever, though also just as talkative and prone to digressions. Ulquin Ibesa, the Isle of the Exiles, said Vane. A fascinating place and a fascinating topic. I wrote a book on the Necromancer's War, you know? Not an easy topic to write about in an objective manner, since so many are ready to dismiss them as monsters and criminals out of hand. Zorian made a sound that could be possibly interpreted as agreement, though really his opinion of Ibesans couldn't possibly be lower. Perhaps if he hadn't repeatedly witnessed all the killings and destruction in Scioria, he might have felt some pity for them, but as it was, they really were dangerous scum in his eyes. Unaware of Zorian's inner musings, Vane launched into a protracted explanation of the causes behind the Necromancer's War. He spoke of succession disputes in several prominent houses and royal families that developed when their leaders turned themselves into liches and vampires and their heirs realized they would never inherit their birthright because their parents would never die of age alone. He spoke of the common people who hated necromancers with a passion, and resented being ruled by the undead. And finally he spoke of Eldamar's desire for supremacy, and how they were all too happy to prove their authority over all of Altazia by getting involved in every dispute they could find in order to place people more sympathetic to them in leadership positions. Finally, it all came to a head when the kingdom of Sulamnon, back then in a personal union with Eldamar, rose in rebellion against their king, supported by Rhea and Namasar. When they lost said rebellion, they were forced to issue a blanket ban on necromancy by the king of Eldamar, or else forfeit their lands to the crown. The ban, if enacted, would gut the entire military of Sulamnon, which made great use of undead in their army at the time, as well as force a number of prominent aristocrats to hand over their titles to their children and go into exile. The necromancers in Sulamnon refused to accept the treaty and raised an army of their own, bolstered by the part of the Sulamnonian military that still felt they had a chance to win if they continued fighting. Soon they were joined by other forces that resented Eldamar's growing power, the remaining Kuski tribes that still retained some military might, the remains of which covens, the undead aristocracy of other countries that saw the way wind was blowing and wanted to overrule the precedent that would see them similarly disposed of, as well as a number of opportunistic actors that felt they had more to gain by siding with the necromancers than with the king of Eldamar. The Necromancer's War had begun. The necromancers soon showed themselves to be cruel and merciless opponents, and the atrocities they committed against captured villages and defeated soldiers shocked the continent. Any sympathies or support they had from neutral parties that wanted to see Eldamar humbled quickly evaporated. Instead of serving as a rallying force against Eldamar domination, they handed the growing kingdom exactly the sort of war they needed to cement their authority and legitimacy. When Eldamar's general Fert Oriclo defeated the necromancer's army led by Quatakikal, thereby destroying them as a coherent force, the continent sighed in relief. The kingdom of Eldamar rewrote the map in their favor, and were seen as heroes for it instead of tyrannical aggressors, and the surviving parts of the necromancer's army fled to the frozen island in the north that would be henceforth known as the Isle of the Exiles Ulquin Ibesa. The king of Eldamar graciously agreed not to pursue them to their new home. No doubt that was because of his great mercy, rather than unwillingness to send soldiers to some worthless ice-swept land in order to pursue a broken enemy. Then again, considering it took more than 100 years before the exiles started making trouble again, Zorian supposed he couldn't blame him for his reasoning. Hell, he still wasn't certain what the Ibesans hoped to gain with their destruction of Scioria. He supposed if their leadership was composed out of immortal undead they might have personally participated in the Necromancer's War and were still bitter about it. Well, I hate to interrupt such a fascinating story, But I was really hoping to ask you about some historical artifacts, Zorian said when he finally spotted a lull in Vana's discussion. Oh, Vana said, perking up. Yes, I'd like to know if you have some sources about the Bakura Gates and the Sovereign Gate. The Sovereign Gate is nothing, Vana said dismissively. The royals won't even let anyone see it, much less examine it. I have doubts whether it exists at all. The Bakura Gates, though. Vana promptly started digging through his stacks of books, and continued to do so for another 15 minutes or so. Finally, he found what he was looking for in some forgotten corner. He leafed through the book until he found the correct page and then shoved it into Zorian's hands while pointing at the illustrations stamped on it. The Bakura Gates did not look anything like Zorian had imagined. When Alanik had described them to Zorian, he figured they were something like stone arches or rings or something like that. Instead, they looked like hollow icosahedrons assembled out of some kind of black bars. Not very gate-like in Zorian's opinion. It's hard to study the gates since no one has witnessed one in actual operation for quite some time, but from the writings found inscribed into their pedestals and preserved written records, we know they function similarly to a teleport platform, Vana said, waving his finger over the illustration for some reason. Only they open a dimensional hole that connects one gate to another instead of teleporting people standing inside. It is probably not a good idea to stand inside the gate while it activates. Zorian gave the man an incredulous look. Well, I mean, it could have some kind of safety feature to abort the activation procedure if someone is standing inside, Vana defended himself. Anyway, the bars are likely stabilizers, making sure the rift stays open long enough for people to step through. They sound really powerful and exotic. I'm surprised there's so little interest in them, said Zorian. Most people think they were not nearly as efficient as modern teleport platforms are, and they are bound to be exorbitantly expensive and difficult to make. The gate spell is almost certainly reverse-engineered from Bakura Gates, back when people still knew how to activate them, and it is pretty much the pinnacle of dimensional magic that very few mages can cast safely. Teleportation magic, on the other hand, is relatively accessible and cheap. In the end, it all comes down to the fact they are currently inert and nobody knows how to use them. If indeed they can be used at all in modern times. They are the oldest magical artifacts that we are aware of. It is possible they broke down a long time ago. How many of them are there? Zorian asked. Hundreds are known, Vana said. Only gods know how many more remain undiscovered in some distant jungle or mountain peak. The Bakura really loved placing those gates all over the place, it seems. I actually think I have a map of all the recorded gates in Altazia. It took more than half an hour for Vana to find the map in the mess that was his house, but he did produce it in the end. Zorian studied it curiously, immediately noting one particular location. Cyoria has a Bakura Gate? He asked incredulously. How? Where? I've never heard anything about that. Oh, that. Vana snorted. I almost forgot about that. That gate is deep within the lower levels of the dungeon beneath Cyoria, very far into the dangerous levels. It would be suicide to go there for most mages, so nobody studies that one to my knowledge. Researchers interested in the gates have safer locations to set up camp at. After studying the map for a while and failing to find anything really notable, Zorian thanked Vana for his time and left. The Bakura Gates were kind of interesting, but he didn't see how they could be connected with the time loop. Another dead end as far as he was concerned, but at least he didn't waste too much time on this one. Break. Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as a sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him, and suddenly he was wide awake, not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. Good morning, brother. An annoyingly cheerful voice sounded right on top of him. Morning, morning, morning. Zorian gave Kiriel an incredulous look. What? Why was he here? The summer festival was still days away, and the last thing he remembered was peacefully falling to sleep. Did Zack die prematurely again, or was he killed in his sleep without even realizing it? He was broken out of his thoughts when Kiriel kicked him, apparently unhappy that he was ignoring her. He expertly stabbed his finger into her flank, causing her to lose her grip on him with a squeal of indignation, and then took advantage of her moment of weakness to throw her off and rise to his feet. I need to cast a spell, he said, looking at her. Please give me some time alone. Can I watch? She asked. Zorian raised his eyebrow at her. Do you think you can keep quiet for 10 minutes? She placed her palm over her mouth, mimicking the sign of silence. Right. Go lock the door then so Mother won't be disturbing us, he ordered. I need utmost concentration for this. Also, Mother would go berserk if she found him pouring salt and quartz dust on the floor, so it was best if she were kept out until he was done. Thankfully, he had both materials available in sufficient quantities, so he would be able to perform the marker tracking spell without delay. 10 minutes later, Zorian was once again given a sense of where all the marked individuals were in relation to himself. 2 of them again. One representing him and the other one in the direction of Cyoria. Less than a minute later, the other marker abruptly shifted positions to the southeast of where it had originally been, and then shifted south again not long afterwards. Teleportation. The owner of the marker seemed to be in quite a hurry to get away from Cyoria. There was no third marker. The other marker was almost certainly Zack, Zorian felt. His classmate definitely began restarts in Cyoria, and it made sense for him to have the marker since Zorian had to have got it from somewhere. That left Red Robe, then either he did not start the time loop in the vicinity of Siren, managed to teleport outside Zorian's detection radius in the 15 minutes or so it took him to set up the tracking ritual, or he flat out didn't have a marker. He would repeat the detection ritual every couple of days and see if the third marker ever popped up. That spell is lame, Kiriel complained, poking him in the flank and disrupting his concentration. Apparently this was as far as her patience went. There is nothing to see at all. Here have a swarm of butterflies, sighed Zorian, conjuring a tiny swarm of glittery, colorful butterflies. It was actually a pretty hard spell to pull off, despite the totally useless effect. It took a lot of skill and practice to make that many animated, solid illusions and make them halfway convincing. Still, the spell's ability to distract and fascinate Kiriel was every bit as great as he had hoped it would be. It took her a full minute to realize he had slipped out of the room. Worth every minute he had spent on learning it. Break. All right, mumbled Zorian to himself, taking a deep breath to steady himself. I have temporarily shut down the house's warding scheme, neutralized both the explosion trap and the sleep one, blocked the acid mechanism and destroyed the alarm beacon disguised as the document seal. This is it. 3rd time's the charm. And with that, Zorian commanded the small wooden golem in front of him to go fetch the papers for him. No way was he going near that safe personally. The wood golem version 2 slowly stepped forward. Its movements were awkward and jerky, but it did not stumble or sway drunkenly, which was a vast improvement over the wood golem version 1. It would be useless in battle, but this task was something he felt his creation might actually pull off. If not, he had a collapsible 10-foot pole in reserve. Amazingly, the whole thing went off without a hitch. The golem reached into the safe and pulled out a stack of documents without some horrid trap mangling it in the process, and then walked up to him and presented him with his prize. It was only when he tried to take the documents from the golem's hands that disaster struck. He foolishly assumed that the golem would automatically let go of the paper stack when Zorian tried to yank them out of his hands, but of course the wooden doll had no such instincts. It was too slow to release its grip, and ended unbalanced when Zorian unwittingly yanked it forward. Before Zorian knew it, the entire stack of papers was sent tumbling through the air and ended up strewn all across the floor of Vazen's living room. Zorian half expected the papers to suddenly burst into flames out of sheer spite, but they thankfully remained intact. Just completely scrambled out of order, probably requiring him to spend hours sorting them out. Ah, screw it, Zorian said, quickly scooping up papers into an unruly pile and stuffing it into his bag. I'll just take the whole thing with me and sort it later. He picked up his klutz of a golem and teleported out of the house. Minor annoyances aside, the mission was a success and he could finally find out what was so important about these documents. Chapter 034. Unreasonable things. He didn't bring the papers to his room, of course. He was confident that there was no tracking spell on anything in the stack, but he was also confident that Vazen would try to divine the location of the papers the hard way once he noticed the theft. He might even succeed, in which case Zorian didn't want them to be near anything that would automatically implicate him in the theft. No sense in taking that risk when he could simply store the papers elsewhere. Elsewhere in this case meant outside Nyazovdveri. That way the papers would be out of range of virtually every divination spell cast from inside the city. Thus, after teleporting around randomly a couple of times to confuse any theoretical trackers, Zorian's last jump took him deep into the forested wilderness to the north of the city, to a location that had a small, convenient cave nearby. He had found the place in an earlier restart, while he had been tracking down ingredients for Silver Lake, and he had felt even then that it would be a nice place to set up camp at. It just needed some touch-ups here and there to make it suitable for his purposes. He conjured a glowing lantern to light his way in the gloom of the cave and got to work. After a quick casting of an area-wide spook animals spell to drive away all the bats and vermin that had taken residence in the cave, he set about using alteration magic to clean the place up and make some shelves and reading surfaces out of the rock. A while later, after he tested things for comfort and stability, he decided that stone chairs perhaps weren't the best idea and instead constructed some basic furniture out of the fallen branches he found in the surrounding forest. They're good enough for his purposes. Now comes the hard part, he spoke to himself. It was time to start constructing the warding scheme for the place. 3 hours later, Zorian had layered every single divination ward that he felt could be useful and a few that he didn't, and had rechecked the whole thing twice to make sure everything was stable and worked correctly. Truthfully, he wasn't satisfied. He had an insufficient collection of different anti-divination spells to set up a proper iron-tight warding scheme, and too little experience to properly judge what was crucial and what was not. In addition, if it took him this long to set up even this mediocre thing, how long would something more complex take? He really needed to get better at warding. He shook his head to clear his thoughts. He needed to get better at a lot of things, but he had to prioritize. Defense against soul magic, then combat skills, then Iranian mind arts. Those 3 things were urgent and couldn't be put off. Everything else was secondary for now, even the mystery surrounding Vezin and the documents. If stealing the documents resulted in his early death, despite the many precautions he took, well, he would just have to set the whole thing aside until he was done with his current main goal, wouldn't he? No, his current defenses would have to be enough for now. He placed the papers he stole from Vezin on the nearby stone table he'd made from the cavern floor, sat down on a chair he'd fabricated from wooden detritus he'd dragged into the cave and began to read. Hours later, when he was finally done reading and organizing the whole thing, he seriously contemplated burning the whole stack down and scattering the ashes in the wind. Safer that way and probably more than a little cathartic. He had expected to find something heavily incriminating, but this was something else entirely. Why did the man keep all of his incriminating correspondence in one convenient place anyway? If it had been Zorian in his shoes, he would have destroyed all the letters once he read them so they couldn't be used against him. Was Vezin keeping them as possible blackmail material or something? So, that was kind of ballsy of him considering what kind of person the man was dealing with. Said person being Sudamir Kandriai, the mayor of Nyazov-Dveri. Because of course it was the goddamn mayor that was behind everything. No wonder that telling the police about the disappearances never went anywhere. Even if somebody had seriously looked into it, they would have been told pretty quickly to drop the case by their superiors. Local governors in peripheral areas such as these were basically tiny tyrants that could do as they pleased, so long as they made sure not to piss off the wrong person or stir up trouble. Not that knowing who was responsible for the disappearances shed any light on the man's motives. When all was said and done, Vezin was merely the guy supplying Sudamir with various illegal materials and occasionally hiring shady people in Sudamir's place so the mayor couldn't be implicated in the deal. The merchant didn't even know about most of the disappearances as far as Zorian could see. In fact, Vezin's shady dealings with the mayor seemed to have been much more benign until about 3 months ago, when the man suddenly upped the game and started demanding much riskier merchandise, in far greater quantities, as well as started arranging full-blown assassinations like the ones directed against him and Olenek. One could tell from the letters that Vezin was getting progressively more disturbed and annoyed at his customer for escalating things like that, especially since Sudamir refused to elaborate on what had caused this sudden change. The deal that Vezin made with a company in Syoria, the one that Guri was so interested in, was basically a bribe that Sudamir had arranged for Vezin to calm him down and keep him cooperative. The blueprints and recipes contained in the documents looked kind of interesting, but there was nothing there that Zorian found really notable or sinister. The names of the 3 businesses that provided the documentation were something he recognized, however, they were run by people that the Arania had identified as members of the Cult of the Dragon. So, the mayor of Nyazov-Dveri had some kind of connection to the Cult of the World Dragon. Significant enough that he could arrange for them to hand over extremely valuable documentation to one of his agents for a mere pittance. Well, the idea that this whole thing was connected to Abasan invaders just got a lot more credible with this, though it was not Vezin that had links to them like he originally suspected. Still, the question of why he was after the soul mages around Nyazov-Dveri remained. Why bother? What did the Abasins get by doing that? Some of these people could only loosely be described as soul mages to begin with, and most of them weren't a serious threat to the Abasin force. Or anyone really. He sighed. Like always, every answer he found seemed to bring up 2 more questions in its wake. He placed the papers on a nearby shelf carved into the walls of the cave, opting not to destroy them just yet, and then went back to his room to get some sleep. Break. After he had gotten some sleep and had a chance to think about things, he decided to put off the investigation of Sudamir's activities for some other time. No sense in stirring up the hornet's nest further when he could just wait for some future restart in which he never stole Vazen's documents and nobody knew they were even being threatened by someone. However, as days passed without incident and nobody ever tracked down the documents to his little forest hideout, he began to relax. He didn't restart the investigation or change any of his plans, but he figured this would be a nice, relaxing restart where nothing of real note happened. He slowly absorbed Alanik's lessons in personal soul sight, fiddled with his Wood Golem version 3, in his free time and made sure to cast the marker detection spell at least once per day. No change. The spell never showed anything except 2 markers. And then 2 weeks into the restart he woke up in the middle of the night to see a black-clad figure with an obscured face and a knife in their hand standing over his bed. Later on he would wonder what had tipped him off that he was in danger, but in that moment he simply reacted. Without bothering to structure the magic into any real spell, he reached out to the blanket covering him and flung it at the assassin in a crude burst of telekinetic force. The man, probably, the build suggested a man, stumbled back as the blanket collided with him, not really hurt but surprised at the maneuver and disoriented by the sudden blindness. Zorian scrambled to his feet, barely managing to get upright before the assassin succeeded in throwing the flimsy fabric off of him and lunged towards him. 3 knife swipes later and Zorian was sporting a deep gash on his arm and a bleeding scratch on his cheek and knew for a fact that he had no chance against the man in a physical confrontation. He frantically searched the room with his eyes, trying to spot something to help himself with, and admitted to himself that soundproofing the room may have been a slight mistake. Only slight, though, because even if he could scream for help he doubted anyone would be able to reach him before the assassin was done with him. No, the bigger mistake was that he opted to sleep with his rod of magic missiles and shielding bracelets in his desk drawer instead of taking them with him to sleep. It was official. After this battle, regardless of outcome, he was going to cast magic missile nonstop whenever he had free time and mana to make it fully reflexive. He couldn't afford to be this defenseless when deprived of his tools. "If I die I will blow us both up." Zorian yelled and meant it. The suicide necklace at least was always with him. Maybe he should put something other than explosives there for situations like this. The man hesitated for a second at the proclamation, but then moved to attack again. That second was enough, though. Suddenly given a moment to concentrate, Zorian blasted the man's mind with telepathic noise. The assassin flinched, aborting his attack, but he didn't go down. Not yet, anyway. When Zorian took advantage of his momentary dizziness to smash a nearby paperweight into his face, though he went down in a spray of blood and didn't get up again. A minute later, after he had calmed down a little and confirmed that the assassin, while still alive, wasn't going to get up anytime soon, he decided he couldn't go to the police with this. They were effectively the mayor's underlings, and Sudamir was likely the one who ordered the man bleeding on the floor of his room to kill him. Or had someone else arrange it for him, more likely considering his behavior from Vazen's letters. The fact that the assassin apparently had a key to his room, which was how he had bypassed Zorian's intruder alarm, didn't help his paranoia any. Regardless, he only really knew one person he could go to with this. Already wincing at the lecture he was going to get, Zorian picked up the assassin's unconscious body and teleported to Alanik's temple. Break. Like Zorian hoped, Alanik readily accepted his explanation that the bleeding man he was carrying was an assassin sent to kill him and agreed to take him off his hands. He even gave Zorian a fast-acting healing potion to deal with the cuts and gashes the man inflicted upon him in their brief life and death struggle, and those weren't exactly cheap. Unfortunately, he also decided that Zorian was now going to move permanently into the temple with him. According to Alanik, he had been expecting something like this to happen ever since Zorian stopped his and Lukav's killings earlier in the month, and this was all the proof he needed that Zorian wasn't safe out there. Who's to say the attackers won't try again and succeed? No, as far as the warrior priest was concerned, Zorian had to be under constant guard until the situation was resolved. Zorian really hated that idea as it meant being effectively under house arrest for the remainder of the restart. But Alanik made it clear there was no way to blow him off without also losing his help in mastering personal soul perception. So that was that. Despite his misgivings, however, it turned out to be something of a blessing in disguise. Since there was not much to do in a small, boring temple, Zorian found himself spending most of his time endlessly casting magic missile in an effort to make it faster and more reflexive. He did make a promise to himself after all. In any case, those efforts attracted Alanik's attention, and he agreed to give Zorian advice on how to improve his combat magic. Admittedly, Alanik couldn't help him much in his self-imposed goal of making magic missile reflexive. That was just a matter of sufficient repetition. Instead, most of his help centered around squeezing the most out of fire spells, which appeared to be his specialty. Thus, whenever Zorian got sick of repeatedly casting magic missile, he worked on mastering the plethora of minor fire spells whose mastery Alanik claimed would increase his ability to wield fire in combat. One made a thin ring of fire around the caster, making the prospect of melee difficult for enemies unless they were willing to get burned. Alanik claimed a skilled caster could increase and decrease the radius of the ring from moment to moment, cause it to split into several weaker rings for better coverage, as well as move the center of the ring's alignment up and down along the caster's body. The second conjured a small flock of fully autonomous, sparrow-sized birds made out of fire to harass the enemy. That one was supposed to be practice for weaving animation magic into fire spells, as the usefulness of the spell depended entirely on how well animated the birds were. And so on and on and on. Alanik knew a lot of minor fire spells. Only 20? Alanik asked. Come on kid, I know you can do better. Zorian ignored him, patiently herding the 20 marble-sized fire orbs into gentle orbits around himself. Casting the spell itself was super easy. Controlling the 20 conjured fire orbs simultaneously was not. I don't want to tire myself out too quickly, Zorian said, testing his control over the orbs by having a couple of them fly out of formation. He had already given himself a nasty burn the last time he used the spell by accidentally slamming one of the fire orbs into the back of his hand and was not looking forward to a repeat performance. The ability to direct the orbs as you wish was an interesting advantage, but that also meant there was little in the way of safety features inherent in the spell. I'll run out of mana too quickly if I start summoning 50 fire orbs all at once. You shouldn't be casting the spell a lot anyway, Alanik said. Sustaining the orbs is by far cheaper than constantly recreating them. The point is to take control of them, and recasting the spell doesn't help you with that. You're just letting your fear of getting burnt control you. Well yeah, I don't want to accidentally burn my eyes off or something, protested Zorian. Alanik sighed and shook his head. You're too tense for this. Take a break and we'll continue this tomorrow. Zorian immediately dropped the spell in relief. No matter what Alanik said, he did not like that spell. Still, Alanik was the fire magic expert here. Can I ask you something? Asked Zorian. Alanik casually waved his hand, telling him to get on with it. Is it true you can selectively burn targets with your spells? That is, flat out exclude people from being damaged by your fireballs and the like. I suppose Luke have told you about that, Alanik mused. Yeah sure, let's go with that. Yes, that is something I can do. More than that, actually. It is nothing you would care to learn, however. It is a difficult skill that requires a lot of specialized training. Years of it. Unless you intend to specialize in fire magic, and you strike me as a generalist mage to be frank, I would not recommend worrying about it. He smiled. Besides, by the time you mastered something like that, the pocket meteor spell you are currently struggling with would be a joke to you, so it's hardly a shortcut to not getting hurt with that. Figures, Zorian said. But you know, a simple fire ward would make that spell a lot safer to practice. Why can't I use it on myself before casting the spell again? Danger sharpens the spirit, Alanik said airily. You'll learn faster and take things more seriously with the threat of horrific burns hanging over your head. But mostly I just wanted to see how long it would take you to remember you can do that. Ugh, Zorian grunted. You're evil. There were no further attacks for the rest of the restart, and this particular one ended right on schedule instead of being cut short like the previous one was. The marker detection spell never displayed a third marker in its detection radius, despite Zorian casting it several times a day towards the end. Break. For the next 3 restarts, Zorian deliberately avoided making any ripples and focused on growing his skills. Not a very exciting time, but by the end of it he was finally able to cast magic missile quickly and easily without any external aid. He had also mastered personal soul sensing well enough that Alanik started teaching him his arsenal of protective soul magic. In addition to that, he learned a plethora of new fire spells, made some improvements to the wooden golem design he was exploring, and practiced the rest of his combat arsenal on the monstrous wildlife living in the wilderness. Unfortunately, Alanik had been becoming ever more suspicious of Zorian as his skills rose with each restart. No doubt the fact that he recognized quite a few of those skills as his own had a big hand in it, and had almost refused to teach Zorian at all in the latest restart. Zorian had eventually managed to talk the man into helping him by promising to tell him everything after the summer festival, but he suspected that pretty soon even that was not going to fly. By his estimation, he had at most 2 more restarts before Alanik refused to teach him anything without a damn good explanation, which he would be unable to provide. But that was fine. By the time that happened, Zorian would no longer be defenseless in the face of hostile soul magic, so the first of his goals would be achieved. He never really expected Alanik to teach him everything anyway. In the next restart, Zorian decided to lift his self-imposed ban of snooping around Sudamir and his activities. As cautiously as possible he tried to find out more about the man. Sudamir being a well-known and public person, it wasn't hard to get people to talk about him, but most of the information he got was either useless or highly suspect. The most interesting piece of information he found was that the man was often absent from Nyazovdvary on various official errands, and that those errands had become especially frequent in the last few months. This was in line with Vazen's letters, which also claimed the man had changed his patterns radically in the last few months. When simple questioning failed to produce any new results, Zorian decided to be a little bolder and investigate the link between Vazen and the mayor. He didn't want to deal with Vazen himself, but fortunately there was no need to. Vazen wasn't a one-man operation like Guri. He had other employees, and those other employees didn't have the same paranoia and level of security that Vazen did. They brought stuff home from work to look over later, left their keys cunningly hidden behind nearby flower pots, and rarely had any sort of magical defenses. One of them even kept a detailed daily journal with all sorts of interesting tidbits and remarks. Probably the most interesting thing he found out from Vazen's employees was that he regularly sent mysterious packages to a place called Ayaska Mansion. A place that his employees were pretty sure didn't actually exist. The place the packages were delivered to didn't exist on the maps, save as a random section of the uninhabited forest far to the north of the city. Further into the wilderness than Zorian ever got in any case. After consulting some maps, Zorian realized that he had no idea how long it would take him to reach the spot in question. Weeks? Months? Damn, those two really picked an out-of-the-way spot for their exchanges, didn't they? This was going to be such a chore. He went to Lukav for help. The transformation specialist was noted to be an outdoorsman type, so he should have some advice on reaching out-of-the-way places like that one. Maybe there was some kind of enhancement potion that could help? No, I don't think enhancement potions would be of much help in this, Lukav told him while staring at the map Zorian provided. They don't last long enough and it would take you at least 2 weeks to reach the place on foot. Tricky. Maybe it's just my bias showing, but have you considered simply shape-shifting into a bird and flying there? I haven't, said Zorian, surprised. The idea never occurred to me. How complicated would that be? Not complicated at all, but perhaps a bit pricey, Lukav admitted. You would probably need to waste a potion or two to grow accustomed to flying and moving in your new form. Maybe more depending on how fast of a learner you are. Birds are very different from humans. He handed Zorian his price chart and quickly pointed out the bird section. I recommend the eagle personally, Lukav said. Good flyer, excellent eyesight, and big enough that few things will dare attack you. Plus it's an eagle, what's not to like? Not like you need to be inconspicuous where you're going. Zorian looked at the price tag attached to the eagle transformation potion. It was doable. He could buy 3 of those if he had to, though he hated using up most of his savings like that. Even though he knew they would be back at the beginning of his next restart, it just felt wrong to fritter them away. He spent years saving that money, damn it. Besides, what if he needed those savings later in the restart for some reason? I guess I could try that, Zorian said. Incidentally, do you pay money for some rare animal that can be found deep in the forest? No. If it can be found in forests around here, I'm more than capable of getting it myself, Lukav said. Sorry. Though if you are willing to risk your life in the local dungeon, there are a few things I would be interested in paying good money for. Break. Gliding upward on an updraft of warm air, Zorian surveyed the landscape around him with impossibly sharp eyes. The experience was impossible to describe. Everything was full of color and detail, like a veil he didn't know he labored under had been lifted off his eyes. It reminded him of the time his parents had brought him to the doctor for an eye checkup and he was told he had to wear glasses. His father had been so disappointed about that, but the moment Zorian had donned the little pieces of glass on his face he knew he never wanted to take them off. This was just like that time, only even more extreme. If he tried, he could discern individual leaves on a tree from a mile away. The houses in the distance that would have been nothing but blurry blocks to his human self were instead rendered with perfect clarity, right down to that old tomcat hiding in the shadow of a chimney on that one house. Being an eagle, Zorian decided, was awesome. Weird but awesome. He flapped his wings a couple of times to change directions, wobbling dangerously for a moment. He still wasn't much of a flyer, truth be told, and the less told about his landings the better. Thankfully, big birds like eagles spent most of their time in the air gliding and catching air currents so he could get by. He fixed his eyes forward in the direction of where Ayaska Mansion was supposed to be and set off into the wilderness. Flying over trees got boring pretty fast, though even with ridiculously enhanced eyesight, the leafy canopy of the forest obscured the surface from scrutiny pretty effectively, so there was nothing to see for the most part. He could see snow-capped mountains in the distance, the infamous winter mountains that dominated the landscape of central Altazia, which were said to be the source of all ice and snow by some an icy, merciless heart of winter that woke up once a year to cover the land in frost until it was inevitably beaten back by the forces of summer, winter giving way to spring. Zorian would like to call that superstition, but for all he knew there could actually be a kernel of truth in that, like an insanely powerful ice elemental living there or something. There was very little known about the mountains, largely because of how dangerous they were. Exploring them was about as safe as trying to map lower reaches of the dungeon, and not nearly as rewarding. Finally, Zorian approached his destination. He had been worried he would miss the spot, since he didn't have a map and everything sort of looked the same to him from his vantage point, but he needn't have worried. Ayaska Mansion was very obvious and easy to spot. It wasn't, like he suspected, some inconspicuous clearing or standing stone that Vazen and Sudamir used as a drop-off point. It was, in fact, an actual mansion. Zorian circled around the building a few times, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. The mansion gleamed white in a sea of green, somewhat worn down by the ravages of age and nature but clearly livable and cared for. Aside from the mansion, there was also a small warehouse attached. The warehouse appeared to be of much more recent construction, however. It had no moss on the roof, there were no cracks on the walls that his enhanced eyes could see, and it was far blockier and utilitarian in construction. Zorian had no idea why somebody would build this thing here. If it was a fort or an observation tower he could understand, but who would want to build a luxury dwelling this isolated and exposed to the dangers of the north? Sadly, his contemplation was interrupted when the crows that dotted the trees around the mansion took exception to his presence and 100 angry caws filled the air. Zorian focused on them momentarily. Though the birds were small and distant, the eyes he currently possessed had no problem in discerning their features. They weren't crows. They were larger, and their pitch-black feathers had small red decorations and an almost metallic sheen to them. Iron beaks. The hellbirds of the north. Zorian didn't fancy his chances against one of those in this form, much less against the huge flock stationed around the mansion. Though now that he thought about it, he could probably cast magic missile in this form now, couldn't he? He might be able to bring down a couple of them before the rest tore him apart, then. That wouldn't get him anything though, so he stopped circling around the mansion and put some distance between himself and the iron beaks until they finally stopped making noise and threatening gestures. He wondered what he had done to upset them so much. He supposed they just didn't like a large predator circling menacingly around them. Well, no matter. Landing right next to the mansion would have been a poor idea anyway. Very exposed and probably warded too. He searched the surrounding area for an open space he could land at without breaking his neck. Transfer of injuries between real and shape-shifted forms was weird and inconsistent, but Luke have assured him that being killed in one form means you're definitely dead in the other as well. And finally found a clearing some distance to the west of the mansion. A little bit farther than he had hoped for, but beggars can't be choosers. After a frankly embarrassing landing that saw him faceplant into the grass, Zorian transformed back into human form and spent several minutes memorizing the place so he could use it as an arrival point for future teleports. That done, he set off towards the mansion hoping to get a closer look. He already missed the eagle's awesome eyesight, but some things were better done from the ground, and this way he would actually be able to teleport away from danger and make himself invisible. As far as he knew, Iron Beaks had no magical senses, so an optical cloak should be enough to evade their attention. He was right. The Iron Beaks took no notice of him while he inched closer to the mansion, cloaked in an invisibility spell and an aura of silence. Before actually scouting the place, however, a pack of winter wolves burst into the scene, led by a particularly huge specimen. Unlike the rest of the pack, the alpha didn't have a white pelt. His was silver and shiny, and his mind felt different from the rest. Stronger, deeper, more complex. Sapient. Zorian stood frozen, watching the group with dread. 22 winter wolves led by an unknown super special sapient variant. Fuck, he just had to push his luck, didn't he? No way would they be fooled by his spells, considering how sensitive canine noses were. Except, they kind of were fooled. At one point the silver one suddenly stopped and started scanning the tree line, and Zorian's heart skipped when its eyes briefly passed over Zorian's location. But then the moment was gone and the pack moved on and disappeared somewhere on the other side of the mansion. A minute later, when he was sure they were gone, Zorian slowly retreated into the surrounding forest and teleported away. Break. Zorian decided to leave the Ayaska mansion alone for the moment. He was virtually certain they were connected to the Abasin invaders now, and definitely intended to get to the bottom of that place at some point. However, he had a feeling that investigating the mansion as he was now would probably involve a lot of dying. Plus, he had a hunch that the mayor was a necromancer, and definitely had one underemployee even if he wasn't, so losing a battle there might have more serious consequences than a premature restart. No, if he wanted to go there he had to finish Alanik's lessons first and greatly increase his combat skills at minimum. Instead, now that his time with Alanik was coming to an end, he had to step up his effort to improve his combat magic so he could go talk to the other Arania tribes and learn the secrets of their mind arts. There were a lot of reasons why that was important, but the one that drove him the most was the possibility of unlocking the matriarch's memory packet that still remained in his mind. The memory packet wouldn't last forever, Zorian knew. It was stable for now, the matriarch having pulled out all the stops to make it as resilient and durable as possible, but it would unravel and fail in time, and all the memories locked within would be gone. If Zorian wanted to fill in the blanks left in the matriarch's last message and understand what made her reach the decisions she did, he had to gain access to that knowledge. He had no delusions it was going to be easy. For one thing, the other Iranian tribes were in no way guaranteed to be friendly, and even if they were, there was no reason for them to actually teach a random human their secrets. And even if he could secure their cooperation, the memories of something as alien as the Arania were bound to be a chore to interpret. And even if he could master that, he still only had one shot at unraveling the memory packet without ruining the content or triggering whatever defenses the matriarch installed to prevent him from doing just that. But that was a matter for the future. Right now he didn't feel very confident walking into a possibly unfriendly Iranian hive. Since he didn't feel like testing his mind magic against the masters of the craft, his current plan for dealing with hostile or treacherous Arania basically boiled down to quick casting Mind Shield and burning everything in sight via more conventional magic. Better combat skills were a must for that plan to work, though. As it happened, he had something that should advance his combat skills, as well as make up for the money he lost to Lukav when he bought those 2 eagle transformation potions. Dungeon delving. He had basically ignored the dungeon entrance at Nyazovdveri due to being sidetracked by the disappearance of local soul mages and Alanik's lessons, but there was no reason to continue to do so anymore. Most of the wildlife around Nyazovdveri had ceased to be a challenge at this point anyway. Thus, 2 days after his hasty retreat from the Ayaska mansion, Zorian walked over to the official entrance to the dungeons beneath Nyazovdveri and requested a permit to descend into its depths. It didn't cost any money, thankfully, and it was really nothing more than a formality to make sure you understood what you were getting into. Just remember, this part of the dungeon has never been pacified properly, the man behind the counter told him, handing him a permit card that he had to show to the guards to be let through. It means there are greater riches to be found down there, but also that things are much more dangerous. People disappear down there all the time. Nobody is going to look for you unless you join one of the local Delver guilds, which I personally recommend to young mages such as you. Zorian gave the man a non-committal hum and left, descending below on a long spiral staircase until he reached a small natural cavern that housed a small town. The inhabitants of the city above called it Delver Village, though officially it was just an extension of Nyazov-Dvary. Not many people actually lived here. The buildings consisted mostly of guild houses and businesses catering to dungeon delvers. He had no intention of joining any of the guilds. Last time he checked, they didn't let new members like him out in the field for at least several months after they joined, which made them pretty much useless to someone in his situation. He did understand the logic of it. You didn't want your new, inexperienced members to get horribly murdered out in the tunnels, and very few mages were particularly capable at his age. But that didn't make them any less useless to him. He also didn't have any money to buy anything from the shops, so he didn't remain in the settlement for long. The people there were jerks anyway, asking for money just to answer basic questions or demanding that he join their guild before they would divulge any secrets. Thank the gods he could just read the answers out of their mind anyway. Zorian stared at the patch of glowing mushrooms at the corner of a largish cave he encountered in his wanderings through the cave system under Nyazov-Dvary. It appeared to be a normal patch of giant glowing mushrooms, little different from the ones he encountered elsewhere around here, but he knew better. He wasn't fooled. His mind sense clearly told him there was an animal mind behind that mushroom. No, wait, the mushroom itself had a mind? An illusion? Or some weird intelligent mushroom? Deciding that it didn't matter, Zorian leveled the combat staff he'd made for himself and fired an incineration ray at the mushroom. If he had learned anything in the 2 weeks he had spent down here, it was that absolutely everything wanted to kill and eat him. And not necessarily in that order. The rock mites, for instance, wanted to paralyze you and lay their eggs into your still-living body so their larvae could eat you alive from the inside out. Anyway, the point was that striking first was common sense with these things, and he had no intention of getting closer to the mushroom impersonator. Sure enough, the moment it was hit by the ray of fire, the mushroom immediately unraveled into a large tentacled form of the tunnel octopus. Figures. The ability of those things to mimic both the color and texture of their surroundings was as impressive as it was annoying to deal with. This one was out of luck, though. Caught off guard by the devastating fire attack, it flailed its tentacles about briefly in panic before collapsing dead on the floor of the cave. Zorian threw a rock at it to make sure it was not faking it and then relaxed. He would have probably died to one of those by now if he didn't have his mind sense. It was without a doubt his main advantage compared to the other dungeon delvers. Thanks to it, he was able to evade the javelin worm ambush sites, tunnel octopuses and other hidden dangers to reach the richer, less exploited lower areas like this one. No wonder Taven had been so excited about having someone with that ability in her team, back when she had first found out about it. He instructed the floating spheres of light around him to scatter around the cavern and slowly inspected the walls for any sign of crystal and strange minerals. In general, crystallized mana seemed to be a much better moneymaker than hunting creatures for parts, at least if you could access virgin areas like this one. Crystallized mana also had the benefit of being, well, static. If he found some in a particular place on this restart, it stood to reason that it should also be there for every subsequent one as well. That meant that, if he could map out where they were over several restarts, he should be able to blitz through a bunch of known sites in just a few hours and get an enormous cash infusion at the beginning of every new restart. Especially if he learned how to filter through dungeon interference and became able to teleport while inside it. Sadly, his inspection found nothing in this cavern. Looking at the charred tunnel octopus corpse, Zorian considered the possibility of just harvesting its brain and beak, the most valuable parts of it by far, and returning to the surface. He had already found 2 large lumps of crystallized mana and several small ones, so this trip was already a smashing success. And continuing further would mean going deeper into the dungeon with all the danger that implied. He continued on, not like he was ever really in danger thus far, so even if the danger jumped up a notch he should be. Zorian rounded a corner and came face to face, so to speak, with some kind of floating pink ooze covered with eyes. It glowed, threads of light dancing throughout its smoky, translucent bulk, and its form writhed and shifted chaotically, ripples and pseudopods growing and retracting from moment to moment. For a moment it appeared to have not noticed him, its countless eyes, each its own color and shade, blinking and swiveling in their sockets with no rhyme or reason. But that moment passed quickly and its many eyes turned towards him, some of them extending on pseudopods so the creature could focus them on Zorian properly. Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as a sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him, and suddenly he was wide awake, not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. "Good morning, brother," an annoyingly cheerful voice sounded right on top of him. "Morning, morning, morning." Sorian looked at his grinning little sister incredulously. "What? But he was just—" "Oh, come on." Sorian groaned, burying his face in his hands. "That's it? It just looked at me and I died? What kind of absurd ability is that?" Kiriel said. "Forget I said anything," Sorian said, giving Kiriel a brief hug before rising to his feet. Kiriel refused to let go, clinging to him like a barnacle, so he just carried her around as he walked to his bookshelf and retrieved his Compendium of Dungeon Denizens, Volume 4, and began leafing through it. "I was just having a dream, that's all." "What kind of dream?" Kiriel asked curiously. "I was going to be rich and then I got killed by an eye-beast?" Sorian said as he looked at the description in the book. Even the name was stupid. "Oh," Kiriel said. "A nice dream that ends in a nightmare. I hate those." "Me too, Kiriel." "Me too," Sorian said, snapping the book shut and placing it back on the shelf. The description in the book told him nothing useful about the damn thing. Beware its deadly eyes indeed. He thought about casting the marker detection spell again, but what would be the point? It never detected more than 2 markers in existence. Or less for that matter. At this point it was obvious that this was all it was ever going to show. Whatever way Red Robe used to get into the time loop obviously wasn't identical to the one used by Zack and Sorian. As for Zack, his movements indicated that he always opened the time loop by hightailing out of Cyoria. The direction was not consistent though, and he seemed to wander randomly around Eldamar during each time loop. He wondered what that was about. Clearly the boy was avoiding Cyoria just like Sorian was, but beyond that he could not figure out what Zack's goal was. Sorian had tried placing the locations Zack visited on a map and found no pattern he could see in it. Whatever. Zack will be Zack. He had his own, more pressing problems to worry about at the moment. "Right. Kiri, could you perhaps let go of me now?"